afternoon. My name is Xavier Martin. I'm Deputy Director at the Digital Frontiers Institute, and I will be moderating this session. This afternoon, I have the pleasure of introducing Jeník of CGAP, a global partnership of leading development organizations that works to advance the lives of the poor people, especially women, through financial inclusion. Ivo has extensive experience in retail finance services regulation at CGAP, as well as the World Bank. Today, we are going to talk about regulatory sandboxes for financial inclusion. We will start out by watching a presentation, and then we will open it up for questions. So please be thinking about the comments and questions you might have and leave them in the live chat. You can already do that right now or during the presentation. So without further ado, we can start the video.
So hello, everyone. My name is Jeník, and I'm very pleased to be joining the Pathway to 17 Summit with a presentation on the role of regulatory sandboxes in advancing financial inclusion. I would like to start my presentation with just a brief overview of what we are talking about when we're talking about regulatory sandboxes. So a brief definition. In our recent paper on regulatory sandboxes, it's actually a technical guide, we say that regulatory sandbox is a tool for developing evidence about how a new product, technology, or business model, in brief, innovation, works and the outcomes it produces. So it's an evidence gathering tool that regulators can use to inform their response to innovation. And the reason why I'm emphasizing the usage here, or the utility of sandbox, is because I believe it's a very important definitional aspect, and maybe quite different from what you're used to when you're seeing a definition of regulatory sandboxes elsewhere. In fact, even in our paper in 2017, the first paper on regulatory sandboxes CGAP produced, we spoke about regulatory sandboxes more from the perspective of what they look like. So, we talked about the framework for small-scale testing put in place by a regulator, where the tested innovation happens in or is getting tested in a contained environment under the supervision of the regulator. And that definition is obviously correct, but it doesn't have that emphasis on what regulatory sandboxes actually do. And so here, I think this is a definition that puts the right focus on the utility of regulatory sandboxes. And we'll be coming back to that point later in my presentation too. So we did in 2019 a sweep of, I think it was around 16 different regulatory sandboxes and close to 135 different firms testing in those sandboxes, relying on publicly available data. And using a fairly straightforward set of criteria, we try to assess how much of those innovations and innovative business models tested in regulatory sandbox are contributing or potentially contributing to financial inclusion. So we look at things such as, is the product targeted at low-income customers? Is the product targeted at customers who are underserved or excluded from the formal financial sector? Is the product delivered in a context and environments where we see a high levels of financial exclusion? Or is the product by its nature relevant to the typically financially excluded or underserved segments, such as remittances? And so using those criteria, we came up with the numbers that you see on your screens. We found that 20% of the innovations tested in the regulatory sandboxes were directly relevant to financial inclusion, and perhaps around 18% more might be relevant to financial inclusion. So I will let you to judge whether those numbers are significant or not. One important caveat is that the numbers come from 2019, when there were not that many regulatory sandboxes yet that would have financial inclusion as their key objective. So the numbers might have actually improved since. The other thing that I'd like to show you is what is the technology that gets tested and what sectors get to benefit most from regulatory sandbox, because I think it's very related to the question of financial inclusion. So this again came from the very same analysis, where first we look at what kind of technology we see in regulatory sandboxes, and perhaps not surprisingly, it was a lot around blockchain and cryptocurrencies. followed by data analytics and digital ID. And then there was this big category of other, where we would see a combination of different technologies being tested. The other question we try to answer, what are the sectors affected? So affected in a positive way, perhaps not surprisingly, payments, number one, followed by wholesale and infrastructure, often related to payments, because these would be things related to how payments are affected, clearing and settlement systems, remittances, and so on. And then third category, advice and asset management. And at the bottom of this slide, you have specific examples of what gets tested in Sandbox: equity crowdfunding, robo-advisors, personal finance management tools, or things such as alternative credit scoring models. Those are some of the examples of what we've seen tested in Sandboxes. Very quickly, this is a situation that we have currently in the world, where regulatory sandboxes are either operational, marked in green, or about to be operational, marked in red. This comes from my World Bank colleagues' work. And since the publication earlier this year, the map probably got more coverage, because there have been multiple announcements of new sandboxes coming. So I'd like to now get into the question that many policymakers, but also providers, face when thinking about the sandbox, and that is, when sandbox is a useful tool and when some other alternatives may be more pertinent. And to answer that question, me and my colleague Sean Duff came up with this decision tree that's basically walking anyone trying to answer that question through 3 simple steps, which are effectively 3 simple questions. And we believe that once you answer those 3 questions, you should know very clearly whether Sandbox is a good solution or not. So let me walk you through those 3 steps. First one, which relates to defining objectives, is effectively a question of what is the problem you're trying to solve? What is the challenge you're trying to address? And we've come up with 3 options that are fairly common, and we've seen them in many different places, and so we think they're a fairly good estimate of what might be the answers to those questions across different contexts. First one, regulator is putting a sandbox in place to learn about marketplace developments, just to keep up with what's happening. Then there are those 2 other options: addressing regulatory barriers or promoting competition and innovation, that potentially may be facilitated by regulatory sandbox, but it all depends on how you answer to the second question. So I'm now skipping the second line and going to step number 2, where the question is, what is the underlying issue, or what is the root cause that is behind the challenge you're trying to address, or the issue you're trying to solve? And again, we've come up with 3 set of options here. Compliance is too costly for innovators. Regulation creates uncertainty that makes innovators hesitant to reach the market, or regulation prohibits innovation right away. And so finally, when you answer with one of those possible options, the third step is really, what do you need to do to address that root cause? And if the answer is, I need to do the live testing because I'm not sure what my regulatory response should be, then Sandbox is the right tool. But chances are that your answer by then is that I need to change the regulation. I need to change how I apply a policy. I just need to have some conversation with providers. Then other options and alternatives might be better than regulatory sandbox. So we believe that through this decision-making process, you can make an informed decision about whether to have a sandbox or not. Then once you decide that you want to have a regulatory sandbox in place, the next question is, what kind of sandbox should it be? Because when you look at regulatory sandboxes around the world, they may look very similar, since most of them would share those 5 design elements: eligibility criteria, governance structure, timing of the applications and duration of the test restrictions and safeguards, and then exit scenarios or options. But if you zoom in, you will see that there are different design choices under each of those elements, and that really what makes for a variety of design options and designs of regulatory sandboxes that we see around the world. So we try to understand whether there are any specific circumstances that drive particular design choices, and make some choices better than other. And we've come up with what we call 3 threshold constraints, which are legal and regulatory framework, market conditions, and the capacity of the regulator to implement the regulatory sandbox, but also capacity of the market to benefit from a regulatory sandbox. And we believe that those threshold constraints or conditions, again, drive a specific design of regulatory sandbox. And in our paper, we actually talk about this in more detail. I'm just giving here an illustration where we try to match those threshold constraints with design choices. And you see, for example, if you have a high capacity environment with high demand for the sandbox, then you may create a very robust regulatory sandbox structure. Whereas if you have a low demand and low capacity, sandbox is not an advisable solution. So in this manner, we kind of proceed across those different pairs and try to explain how threshold constraints drive different design choices. The other point I'd like to briefly touch upon is once you are beyond this stage and you're hitting the implementation part, then what are the ingredients for success, for a successful regulatory sandbox initiative? And again, we've come up with the 4 key ingredients that really drive a successful sandboxes. One is obviously appropriate design, and this one really comes only after you are very clear on what objectives or issues you're trying to address with sandbox. The number 2, well-defined governance and processes. Number 3, sufficient capacity and resources, because indeed regulatory sandboxes require capacity and require resources. And then strong stakeholder buy-in, both internally and externally. Externally, so that the market and customers understand that this is something that is potentially beneficial. Internally, so that everyone within an institution understands what is their role in supporting regulatory sandbox implementation. The final point here to emphasize is that regulatory sandboxes by no means are the only solution, and you should have got that idea from what I already presented. There are other options, and you see on our decision tree that actually many lines do not end up with sandbox, but with the alternatives such as other innovation facilitators, a policy update, or other regulatory tools such as waivers, exemptions, and the likes. So the key takeaways from this should be many regulatory objectives concerning innovation can be achieved through other tools, but regulatory sandbox is very helpful where live testing is important or necessary to inform a regulatory response to innovation. Specific design elements fit specific circumstances. Successful implementation requires clearly defined ownership of sandbox and clearly defined KPIs. And some sandboxes indeed help to advance financial inclusion if the innovation that gets tested in those sandboxes is an inclusive innovation. If you want to learn more about this topic, please visit our knowledge hub at cgap.org/sandbox. So thank you very much for listening. And now I'm looking forward to answering your questions.
Excellent, Ivo. Thank you so much for this presentation and for sharing with us the results of this interesting research that you have conducted. And I really encourage all the audience to really look at these resources, because really are very good resources if you really want to understand a little bit more on regulatory sandboxes around the world and some of the lessons learned. So, Ivo, let me open the conversation by asking you a little bit more about. You were talking a lot about innovation, no? So let me ask you, how can regulatory sandbox promote innovation in general and innovation particularly for this 20% that we saw in the pie chart that you showed us on your presentation, no? Innovations that are really aiming to go deeper in financial inclusion.
Thank you, Javier. And let me first thank you and DFI for having me. It's a great pleasure to be participating in this very important summit. So thanks for that. Yeah, this is a very important question. I also encourage the participants to start using the chat function and just come in with their questions as well. So how can regulatory sandboxes really promote innovation, and specifically innovation that is inclusive? I mean, it's a question that we've been wrestling with at CGAP, and you know, our sort of running hypothesis was that regulatory sandboxes are relevant to financial inclusion to the extent to which innovation that goes through those sandboxes is relevant to financial inclusion itself. In other words, sandbox on its own is just a tool. It's just an environment for the innovations to get tested. And it's a role of the regulator to use it wisely, and if interested in advancing financial inclusion, to use it to advance that goal, which we would argue in many of our previous publications could happen, for example, by designing regulatory sandboxes that have financial inclusion as a very specific objective and theme of the sandbox. But as I mentioned in the presentation, there is a limit to what sandbox can or cannot do. And I see the connection between sandbox and innovation really along how much it helps regulators get sense of what innovation does and how it interacts with the marketplace before they can come up with any sort of regulatory response. In other words, regulatory sandbox can help to advance innovation, particularly by giving regulators enough information in a timely manner so that they can decide if there is a regulatory framework that currently inhibits that innovation from happening. And obviously that innovation is relevant to financial inclusion, then the regulators can make a decision how to address that barrier that currently exists. Do they want to change the rules? Do they want to amend the rules? Do they want to just change the application and interpretation of the existing rules? Or do they need entirely new framework? And I'll give one example, which is, for instance, the customer onboarding through remote channels. So we've seen regulatory sandboxes helping regulators to actually get a sense how customers can be currently onboarded and the customer due diligence can be implemented remotely without facing the customer face to face. And sandbox helped to generate that evidence about how the technology works and how reliable it is from the AML/CFT perspective. And then they could play on those new insights to change the regulatory framework and open it up for a new ways of customer due diligence, including the remote means of identification.
Excellent, Ivo. I see that we have several questions on the chat, so let me share some of these questions with you. This is a very particular question. You were talking about blockchain, about central bank digital currencies, and we have one question from Mahmoudul that want to know a little bit the difference between piloting a CBDC and testing CBDC in a sandbox. Is the same thing here? Are we talking about the same or are different things? Testing in a sandbox or piloting a project on CBDC?
Right, that's a very clear question. And I would say that, it kind of links back to the definition that I presented at the very beginning and how I and CGAP team understands the sandbox. Because sandbox per se is a concept that's taken from the IT world, where before you launch any sort of application or new iteration live, you test it in a safeguarded environment so that if something goes wrong, your systems are not affected, your clients are not affected. So that's the very idea of sandbox. And regulatory sandbox does something similar, creating a safeguarded environment, but in the live marketplace. And testing, and that's why I think regulatory is important here. It's testing the boundaries of regulatory framework. And I've seen regulatory sandboxes being used and the definition being applied in a different ways. But I think strictly speaking, what has to be tested in regulatory sandbox is the boundaries of regulation. Now, when we talk about pilots more broadly and CBDC pilots, for example, they would have a regulatory aspects to it, definitely. But I think there are perhaps broader than regulatory sandbox, the way I define it and the way I understand it. And they're just as any other pilot when you are testing a new thing and innovation. So I would say there is an overlap, and I can imagine a regulatory sandbox for a CBDC or for a cryptocurrency testing, for instance. But the overlap is not 100%, and I think the pilots are broader. And I just add to it one other example. It's the same thing as the test and learn approach, right? Test and learn approach, as we see it, for example, or saw it, for example, in Kenya or Philippines with mobile money, is a very similar concept to sandbox. And it's also a very similar concept to pilot. It actually has a combination of both. You're testing a new product, You just want to see whether the technology works, whether the product makes sense. But there is also a testing of regulatory boundaries, trying to understand whether the existing payments regulation would be sufficient to govern the mobile money, or whether more is needed, as we learn. So in a way, test and learn is a precursor to regulatory sandboxes the way we know them today.
And when I was seeing this decision tree that you were mentioning in your presentation, I was wondering what are the market conditions that you think that should be in place for a regulatory sandbox to make sense? What are the market conditions?
Yeah, so that's a very good question. It's a tough one too. It's a tough one, not because it's hard to answer, but it may be not. My answer may not please some. So I would say that, you know, ideally the market conditions are such that there is a demand for regulatory sandbox. I know that there are initiatives where regulatory sandbox is expected to jumpstart the fintech market, and maybe it does work that way in certain circumstances. In other words, you know, regulators who do not see enough of fintech startups, for example, coming to their market, believe that regulatory sandbox will help to change it and will help to attract more. And this could be the case, but I would argue that more initiatives that need to support the sandbox. There has to be some sort of broader range of incentives to really create a new fintech market. So I would say, if you are launching a sandbox, you need to see a demand for it. In other words, you need to be hearing as a regulator from the market that there are uncertainties around regulation. Some regulation seems to be outdated or going against the innovation. Innovators are sort of keen on having that conversation and live test with the regulators. So I would refrain from saying how many of those demands you need to have, but you need to be hearing from the market. I think it's wise to listen to the market and create a sandbox in response to what is already being demanded.
And following up on that, I see on the chat a question from Simon Andernilola, is the director of Paricover, talking about fintechs, and insurance fintech. And he asked about some African, I will read from here. He says, some African countries have implemented cut-and-paste regulatory sandboxes. In such situations where the box has been ticketed as done, how can the fintechs and industry players help the regulator imbibe the learnings from the test to impact regulation?
Yeah, that's a very important question. And you know, in the section of my presentation where I talked about the design elements, this is precisely sort of warning against just copying and pasting the frameworks from elsewhere, because I truly believe that it matters how you design the sandbox to your market. So if you already end up with in your market with a sandbox that you feel is not appropriate for the circumstances because it's been just taken from somewhere else, I would expect the regulator to actually find out over the time, because, you know, ideal scenario is that as a regulator, you have your own KPIs and you want to see something in response to the sandbox. At the bare minimum, you want to see a few applications being accepted to the sandbox, testing done, you know, and some results of the testing. If that does not work, or it doesn't work and doesn't meet the expectations, we've always been advising regulators to, you know, maybe take the first year as a pilot of the sandbox and then look back and see, are things working? You know, have we got the right design, or do we need to make tweaks? And there are few examples. I was kind of about to say many, I don't know if many, but there are definitely examples of regulators doing this. Even the UK has made a few iterations, moving, for example, from the cohorts to the ongoing application process, from more generic sandbox towards the thematic sandboxes. Singapore is doing iterations with their Sandbox Express. Sierra Leone has done iterations on their sandbox, also moving to changing the cohort-based approach. So this is a best practice almost. And so if that's not happening, maybe the industry should be sort of pushing or making the regulator aware that, you know, it's time to review the design and maybe tweak it so it's more suitable to the local circumstances.
Excellent. And Ivo, I really like when you were talking about the secret sauce to make sandboxes work. And I see that there is also a question that I think is somehow related about what are the skills to combine. So I understand from the skills in the sandbox, or I would frame maybe what are some of the key elements for sandbox to work well?
Mm-hmm. Well, there are few, but if I just start with the skill set, so one interesting observation I think me and my colleagues made is that very often the successful sandboxes very cleverly combine the experienced with enthusiastic. And what that means is that you will find sandbox teams, those that are in charge of implementing sandbox, to be a mix of a more junior staff with less regulatory and supervisory experience, but a lot of enthusiasm and a lot of sort of appetite to take risks and to test new things. But you also need to have obviously the expertise and wisdom of regulators who've been seeing things and know what risks to be aware of. That works very often very well. So I wouldn't say there is any particular skill set that's needed, but there is this mindset that is needed, and that mindset is to be open to do things in a different way, and the mindset of sort of listening to the industry and being responsive. And I would mention what often people ask regarding the skill set is, how much of technical and technological expertise is needed to support a sandbox. And I would say there is always some need for a technological and technical expertise, especially if you get a very sophisticated application where technology plays a key part in how the innovation operates, which often happens. But then I don't think it's important to have that skill set permanently sitting in the sandbox, because very often it's a very unique skill set that you need for the very unique or narrow set of applications. For example, somebody who's expert in AI, ML, or somebody who's expert in blockchain. You don't necessarily need to hire those people permanently, but you need to have access to the expertise if the need arises. And that expertise may be sitting somewhere in your institution. It might be in the IT department, or it might be in the licensing department, I don't know. Or you need to hire an external expert for that particular task. But related question to that is, do you need to then outsource entirely that process because of the technological aspects? And I would say no. Core expertise should still sit within the central bank or other regulator, but occasionally you may need to hire an external expert to help with some parts of the sandbox process.
Excellent, Ivo. We are entering the last 3 minutes of the session. So let me finish by asking you one last question. From your research, what are some of the lessons learned from the implementation of regulatory sandboxes around the world?
Sorry, what are the lessons?
Lessons learned from the different implementations of regulatory sandboxes around the world. So countries that have tried to implement a regulatory sandbox, what we can learn from these experiences?
Well, so I would say first that it really matters how do you define the objective. Launching a sandbox should only come in place where you clearly know what is the issue that you are trying to solve. And that's not really saying much, but it's very important to keep that in mind, because once you know the objective, you know what you want to advance, you should be able then to design the sandbox in a way that helps to advance that objective. And you should be also able to measure the impact or measure the progress and constantly match it against your expectations, so that you can make those tweaks and changes along the way if they're needed. The other important thing is that you really need to have owner of the sandbox process, somebody who really is fully invested in that initiative and is dedicated to advance it. And that owner should be either him or herself, or supported by someone from the very top of the organization. The other important thing is related to that. You need to have a buy-in from within the institution, because sandbox teams are usually very small, but they heavily depend on other parts of the regulatory authority. So very often sandbox teams need support from the legal, from regulatory, from licensing, from the IT team, and so on. So people within the institution need to understand why sandbox initiative is important and why should they support it. And by the same token, you need to have support from the industry. So having a good consultation process, getting the buy-in from the industry, explaining to the industry why the initiative is important is another important lesson learned.
So interesting. Unfortunately, we are just about out of time for this session. Ivo, it's been great to have you with us this afternoon, sharing your insights on regulatory sandboxes. We really look forward, as always, to having the chance to work with you again soon in the future. And audience, thank you for your attention, the participation, your questions. I'm looking forward to the rest of the summit tomorrow, and I hope to see you there too. So goodbye for now. And again, thank you so much, Ivo, for joining us.